So, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening now. So, truth, beauty, play. What next? Now what? These are not niche topics, to put it mildly. In an intellectual climate that has become suspicious of universalism, Burhan has reminded us how much is at stake in the great ideas that cross boundaries from wherever they start and wherever they end. And that these ideas are put to work and play in the arts that make us, for better and worse, human. I greatly admire the way in which Burhan has moved between big ideas and particular texts, between propositions by Plato, Tolstoy, Wittgenstein, texts by Marquez, Oscar Wilde, Tove Jansson, and today, I believe, Virginia Woolf. But he has also moved between the headiest of ideas and the most corporeal of experiences, including his own, not to mention the life of the spirit. What a privilege it is to listen to a real writer. Burhan is a very real writer, but he also lives and works in a world in which writers risk their lives and well-being in pursuit of the truth, beauty, and play that make our lives worth living. To the question, is life worth living? William James answered resoundingly, maybe. I take Burhan's answer to be less hesitant than this, and it's founded on the magnificent description of Homo Artifex with which he has graced us and will grace us again in this, his fourth and final lecture. Burhan.
Adrian, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming again to this last part of lectures on Homo Artifex. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, written in the 14th century, begins with a fear of death and flows in an air of sexuality and humor. Sexuality is attached to the freedom of the body, humor to the freedom of the mind in the face of the dark ages. The freedom of body and mind is an expression of desire for life versus death. And this becomes possible through the liberation of human beings from the command of religious authority and of women from the domination of men. Love and women's liberation in the Decameron was at the same time a social and political opening. Despite the fact that the divinities moved away from the earth and settled in the most inaccessible heavens beyond the human being, in the Decameron, Boccaccio presented the reality of the earth to people and constructed a language in accordance with concept time by interpreting the cause of the plague on medical grounds without resorting to the discourse of divine punishment. Boccaccio not only talks about womanhood, but also directly addresses women, beginning the Decameron as follows, quote, "Every time I stop to consider your natural inclination to pity, most gracious ladies, I recognize that you will find the opening of this present work abhorrent and distressing, for so is the painful recapitulation of the recent deadly plague." End quote. The human is a living being that has learned to say, "I am." In order to understand itself, I looks at the other and tries to define it. It searches everywhere, from nature, which is the accessible other, to God, who is the inaccessible other. Human being is I. Seeing the other in ourselves and perceiving that the other in ourselves harbors differences is mirror consciousness. Fear is a distance that expands from the inability to understand the other. Fear can be healed by overcoming the distance between I and the other. This is peace. Seizing the I of the other is a denial of peace in life. The social other is innumerable. The youth who don't fit into the tribe, the neighboring nation on the other side of the border, or the women confined to the domestic sphere. Animals, forests, and seas are included in this ever-lengthening list of the other. Friday is Robinson Crusoe's ideal other. Women is humanity's first Friday. Women's liberation from otherness doesn't happen when Robinson frees her, but when she names herself. In otherness, women is nothing but a body. When Queen Margaret de Navarre died in 1549, her manuscripts were found among her personal belongings. Margaret de Navarre tried to do what Boccaccio had done in the Decameron 2 centuries earlier, this time with the voice of women. And just like Boccaccio, she set up stories that 10 people told each other for 10 days. She could complete only 7 days in her manuscripts and wrote 2 stories for the next day, leaving a total of 72 stories. In reference to Decameron, which means 10 days, her unfinished book was called the Heptameron, or 7 days. In an age when women were imprisoned in their bodies by the concept of virtue, Margaret de Navarre described the tension between love and virtue and questioned the matters of rape, honor, and obedience. In her book, if her book had not been left unfinished, she would perhaps have written stories that connected love to freedom for the emancipation of women, at a time when the waves of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation swept across Europe. Tolstoy first thought of naming his novel Anna Karenina as 2 marriages, and formed the opening sentence of the book accordingly. Quote, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." End quote. Despite Tolstoy's initial plan, Anna Karenina claimed her own name in the story and carried her name to the cover of the book. She paid the price for integrating love and freedom with her own life. In art, the death of every woman was the repeat of a murder. Who murdered Anna Karenina? Who murdered Madame Bovary and Murasaki in the tale of Genji? For an answer, there came Orlando. Although the protagonist of Virginia Woolf's novel Orlando has lived for nearly 400 years, they are only 30 years old on 11 October 1928 in the last scene of the story. Orlando is born male, interested in poetry. When he is about to leave Istanbul, where he spent 100 years of his life, he falls into a long sleep, and when he wakes up, he realizes that his body has been transformed, that he has become a woman. She embraces her new body with enthusiasm. "Praise God that I am a woman," she says. She returns as a woman to England, where she left as a man. Women who have been the other of men are now conscious of themselves of choosing to be women. The time has come. Orlando has her own house, her own money. Womanhood is no longer an innate body, but a freely chosen and constructed gender. Orlando is the step that changed the entire literature about women, from the religious scriptures to the war epics, from the legends to the fairy tales. The publication date of the novel, 11 October 1928, symbolically points to the beginning of the women's age. It's not coincidence that, at the time of Orlando's publication, Virginia Woolf was giving lectures on a room of one's own to female students here at the University of Cambridge and expressing women's liberation. Orlando loves her female body and poetry in equal measure, and finally publishes The Oak Tree, a poetry book she has been working on for centuries. These two elements, womanhood and art, are the keys to the new utopia. The thought that separates mind and body and explains all existence in terms of dualism is not only seen in Plato, but spreads to every place and every age, from the myths of religions to the philosophy of Descartes. Accordingly, mind and body are claimed to be two separate things. The mind is seen as essence, the body is object. Orlando was an answer to overcome this dualism, to unite mind and body, and to present wholeness to the people of the new age. While the Orlando moment that changes the fate of womanhood becomes the voice of a new philosophy of life, it doesn't stop there, but also opens doors to cross other thresholds. In the novel, Orlando frequently changes her desires and tendencies, and she is attracted to both men and women. Thus, she embraces the other of the new age, those who have orientations other than the male and female gender. Virginia Woolf writes the 73rd story in the Women's Unfinished book. While that story glorifies the freedom of she to exist in the world of he, it also calls out the voice of the next, the 74th story, where the freedom of she invokes the freedom of they. In the last pages of The Republic, Plato describes souls choosing a new cycle of life. It's a long quote. This choice of lives among the various souls was a sight well worth seeing, and one which commanded pity, laughter, and amazement. He saw the soul of Tamiras choose the life of a nightingale. He saw a swan choose a human life by way of a change, and the same with other musical creatures. The soul which drew number 20 in the lottery chose the life of a lion. This was the soul of Ajax, the son of Telamon, shunning the life of a man as he remembered the decision over the weapons. The one after him was the soul of Agamemnon, because of what had happened to it. This soul too had a hatred of the human race. It chooses the life of an eagle instead. The soul of Atalanta had drawn a number somewhere in the middle. When she saw the wonderful prizes of a man who was an athlete, she couldn't resist them and chose those. And after her, he saw the soul of Epeius, the son of Panapus, taking on the nature of a woman, skilled in the arts. Swan, nightingale, lion, eagle, man, and woman. In the epic dream, where everything turns into something else and the new unity can be realized, he, she, it adopts one another. Not only is the commonality of the sexes, but the unity of human being and nature is also depicted here. This is the sky map for tonight. If you would like to see this, wake up just half an hour before the sunrise tonight. Look at the east. This is the picture in the east tonight, tomorrow morning. In the Middle Ages, Iranian thinker al-Biruni, while classifying celestial beings according to genders, also included hermaphrodite. Quote, all of the three superior planets and the sun are male, Saturn among them, being like a eunuch. Venus and the moon are female, and Mercury hermaphrodite, being male when associated with the male planets, and female when with the female. When alone, it is male in its nature. End quote. Orlando is reflected from the mirror of orbiting Mercury. Maybe this was the utopia that never came true in that game of our childhood where we called the rainbow the fox's wedding and ran to reach it with the belief that if we achieved this, we would switch to the gender we wanted. Orlando managed to cross that rainbow. Virginia Woolf's preoccupation with the concept of time creates for her the power to distinguish between time and clock. She believes in time, not in the clock. And in Orlando, she builds new time for the new human being with lifespans and stories and that outstretch centuries. In the age when human being invents the clock and lives by the clock, art opens the door to the future by trying to keep time in its hands. Whereas Robinson Crusoe establishes his own time on the island by teaching the other Friday his own language, Virginia Woolf indicates a new time by calling for women to have a voice of their own. Orlando, who says, "Time has passed over me," at the end of the novel, also declares the plurality of life, saying, "Nothing is any longer one thing." Free women is the construction of potentiality in human being. György Lukács, Hungarian philosopher and literary critic, wrote his first book, The Theory of the Novel, in 1916, during the First World War. While republishing this book 46 years later, he added a foreword and stated that the views he expressed in this book were wrong. Even though among those who read and praised the book at the time were sociologists such as Max Weber and novelists such as Thomas Mann. Despite Lukács accusing his own book of being under the influence of Hegelianism, I find this first critical work to be mind-expanding and enlightening. Lukács also mentions an old dream of his in the new foreword. In fact, he wanted to write this non-fiction book in the story form of the Decameron. But due to the rush of the war years, he completed his book in a pure non-fiction language. He says the following in the preface he wrote 46 years later, quote, "At first it was meant to take the form of a series of dialogues. A group of young people withdraw from the war psychosis of their environment, just as the storytellers of the Decameron had withdrawn from the plague. They try to understand themselves and one another by means of conversations, which gradually lead to the problems discussed in the book, the outlook on a Dostoevskian world." End quote. The desire to emulate the form of a classical work or to be in open dialogue with it is inherent in the writing of authors, as revealed in James Joyce's Ulysses. When I was writing my novel, Istanbul, Istanbul, I wanted to write it in the form of the Decameron. In the Decameron, 7 women and 3 men escaped from the plague in Florence, settling in a safe house, telling stories to each other for 10 days. I placed my characters in a dark cell, which is a kind of plague. In my novel, 4 prisoners in a cell tell each other stories when they are waiting for their torture session. Like the Decameron, my story lasts 10 days. It consists of humorous and sexual stories. The only difference is this. People in the Decameron have escaped from the plague and are now in a safe house. But people in Istanbul, Istanbul are still in the arena of pain and death. I also used a story from Decameron in my novel. While deciding which story to use, I trusted Italian film director Pier Paolo Pasolini. Pasolini adapted the Decameron into a movie in 1971. He chose 12 stories out of 100 in the book, wrote them as scripts and shot them into a movie. But while preparing the release version of the movie, he used 11 of these shots and gave up using one of them. When I was a young lawyer, I read the script of the movie and loved that story that left out. This was the 10th story told on the 3rd day in the Decameron. Thus, in addition to an obvious reference to the Decameron, I also wanted to salute Pasolini, who was later murdered brutally, a case that has yet not been resolved in Italy. If a novel talks about a city, it starts to resemble that city. I adopted this and used the currents of the water in the Bosphorus in Istanbul for this purpose. In the Bosphorus, water flows in two different directions. While on the surface, the waters of the Black Sea flow southward, under the sea, the current reverses and goes northward. I had learned about the coexistence of two different currents at secondary school, and I thought that this was a magic of life, and that, of course, this magic would only suit Istanbul. What is the connection between suffering and storytelling, or even humorous storytelling? I asked myself while writing this book. I reckon that life always carries visible and invisible aspects together, just as two different currents in the Bosphorus coexist despite going in opposite directions. I thought that the character of Orlando, with the androgynous personality, combined two different genders within themselves, and this respect resembled the currents of the Bosphorus. Virginia Woolf had traveled to Istanbul twice and placed the character Orlando there, giving them a long life in the old city. In every respect, Orlando reflected the 17th century Istanbul in which they lived. Races, languages, religions, and everything existed side by side in a single urban body. Having more than one color in a body, like a rainbow, is something that can spread not only to gender, but to all areas of social order. Orlando's time can also be read as the time of a new social life. A human being who knows nothing cannot comprehend the enchantment of existence. A human being who knows little worships the enchantment of existence. A human being who knows much internalizes the enchantment of existence. While human being is a theme in existence, through consciousness they turn existence into a theme for themselves. Believing in divinities was the desire to divinize humans. Humans began to create that divine creature in themselves by dressing it in clothes, making it light fire, and making it engage in art. Humans combine in their soul the mind's will to reason, the heart's will to believe, and the art's will to imagine. Forgetting time and feeling eternity during a song of a few minutes duration gives one both the hope of possessing time and the sorrow of losing it, because they simultaneously experience both the probability of being in a dream while awake and the probability of being awake while dreaming. The scientific determination that the rainbow is the reflection of sunlight from raindrops doesn't determine the state of the rainbow, in the words of the Romantic poet, or the brush strokes of the Impressionist painter. A work of art can be perceived as a thing in itself. The debate among thinkers who take the view that art is a reflection of reality is not about whether this reflection is beautiful or ugly, but whether it's true or false. Let's remember Herman Melville's words in Moby Dick, quote, "So there is no earthly way of finding out precisely what the whale really looks like. I couldn't draw so good a one," end quote. There are different alignments between the whale reflected upon and the whale in reality, and both carry different realities. Art, by keeping a distance from real being, reflects being in a new sequence that is a new context, and it takes one beyond everyday reality. Lovers who run away from the rain in the reality of life can wander for hours in the rain of a poem. To say that the rain in the poem is more beautiful and closer to our soul is to move away from one reality and get closer to another. Art doesn't wonder what is not found in a child but acquired in an adult. Instead, art wonders what is potentially present in a child but not revealed in an adult. As Spinoza says, a falling stone may think that it's completely free and that it continues in motion for no other reason than that it so wishes. But human being thinks what else they are capable of doing besides falling. There are three kinds of people who make art. Those who make art with the voice of the dead, those who make art with the voice of the living, and those who make art with the voice of the unborn. The tranquility of the first, the vitality of the second, and the promisingness of the third all intertwine and build a soul out of human beings' flesh and bone. Throughout history, the fact that different art languages and movements appear to be in opposition to each other and that one art language proclaims the poverty of others stems from the weak mind's effort to reduce art to a single dimension. This is an endeavor to make the voice of the living dominate over the voice of the dead, or vice versa. While the human, as a concrete and singular being, tries to perceive the abstract and the universal through different channels, the multifaceted expansion of art often becomes stagnant with the singular logic of the mind. The human being who listens to the voice of the I too much cannot hear the voice of the dead and the unborn, and they cannot transfer the distance between themselves and the truth despite all their speed. The language of art, interacting with the voice of the dead and the voice of the unborn, is established by direct and indirect discourse. The fact that beauty gives a sense of both attainable truth and unattainable meaning is because it speaks directly and indirectly at the same time. This is how Shakespeare forms it. Dialogue between Hamlet and Polonius. Do you see that cloud that's almost in shape like a camel? By the mass, and it's like a camel indeed. Methinks it's like a weasel. It's back like a weasel, or like a whale, very like a whale. They talk about cloud, camel, weasel, whale, and so on. These things may all be one and the same, or they are really different things, like having visions. Nostos is a theme described in ancient Greek history. It represents the hero's return to home after a long separation. Homer's Odyssey is a Nostos story. It tells the adventures of Odysseus, who participated in the Trojan War, and his return to his home and family. Nostos is what is possible. Where returning home or returning to the past is not possible, that means when Nostos is impossible, then nostalgia arises. The word nostalgia is derived from nostos. It refers to a return that doesn't occur. Then the current place turns into a place of exile. Just as Novalis says, philosophy is really homesickness, we can also say language is really homesickness. It's the urge to be at home everywhere. The fact that my native language, Kurdish, was despised and coded as a mountain language for 100 years created a permanent feeling of exile. We were in our home, but we were not able to reach it. We had to speak a language that didn't belong to us. I was over 30 years old when I first read a Kurdish novel in my life. In order to escape the pain of living with a sense of nostalgia, I decided to return home, that is, to my native language. After writing 5 novels in Turkish, I embarked on my own Nostos journey and wrote a Kurdish novel for the first time. My novel in Kurdish, published just 3 months ago, tells a story about Franz Kafka. Its title is Evindaren Franz K, Lovers of Franz K. It is currently being translated and will be released in English in January. It's a story of love and adventure set during the 1968 youth uprising in the maps of Paris, Istanbul, West Berlin, and Tel Aviv. While a group of young people hunts down and punishes former Nazi officers, they also decide to defend dead writers. They say that dead writers are abandoned. There is no one to defend them other than the readers. And they begin with the decision to avenge Franz Kafka. When Kafka was dying, he wrote his will down and left it to his best friend, Max Brod, asking him to burn all his manuscripts and notes. As we know, Max Brod didn't comply with this will and publish all the books. These young people in the story, who follow Immanuel Kant's concept of truth, believe that Max Brod betrayed Kafka. While writing this novel, I felt that no matter what language it is written in, literature has only one language, and that is literature itself. Writing this book in my native language was an effort to open a new window into the language of literature. Around the time my novel was released, a strange thing happened. Gabriel Garcia Marquez's new book, Until August, was published in March, 2 months ago. It was a short manuscript, in fact. Before he dies, Marquez realizes that these notes are not developed enough and that he cannot complete them anymore. And he tells his sons, if I die, don't publish this. But when his 2 sons published the book 10 years after their father's death, they wrote a foreword to the story and said this, quote, in an act of betrayal, we decided to put his readers' pleasure ahead of all other considerations. If they are delighted, it's possible Gabo Marquez might forgive us, end quote. In an interview they gave to a newspaper, in a very epic tone they say this, yes, it was a betrayal, but children exist for this reason. My novel starts at the end of the story. When young people who swore to avenge Kafka attempt to kill Max Brod, one of them is caught. The story, which begins with the dialogues between this young assassin and the police commissioner at the police station in West Berlin in 1968, progresses towards the past, and we try to understand what is betrayal and loyalty, and what is the true meaning of love in literature. The lifespan of every human being is as long as the lifespan of their own universe. And when a person ends, so does their universe. In order to transcend this close destiny, the human being acts, thinks, and dreams. Life and death are both magnificent and terrifying separately, but when they come together, they become art. The artist is the peacemaker who establishes the language of this unity. Horace says in A Letter to Augustus, quote, one who knows nothing about ships hesitates to steer them. Doctors look after their own profession. Craftsmen play crafts. And he continues, but we all write poetry, taught and untaught alike. This is an aberration, a mild form of madness, but it has many advantages. It is poetry that placates the gods of heaven and underworld. End quote. Human being, unlike animals, imagines while doing. Since reasoning is not limited to being aware of what exists and understanding it, but also being able to envision what it could be and what it should be, the field of imagination opens up. Before human being, the essence of matter was nothing but matter itself. ever since humans added their own view, mind, and dream to matter, its essence has changed. Logos is the understanding of the relationship between the existence of matter in itself and its existence through the human look. The primary substance is the essence that exists with human consciousness, while the secondary substance is the essence that exists without human beings. While the axe in hand is actuality, the word axe is potentiality. It says more. Therefore, the word axe becomes primary. The word human is also more immense and promising than the current state of the being called human. This is dark because it's about night and sleep and dreams. It's dark like the underground labyrinths of human soul. You like darkness, maybe. Maybe you don't. Is there any scene you don't like while reading a novel or watching a movie? For example, my Italian publisher told me that if the word desert appeared on the first page of a novel, he had difficulty reading that book. I had an agreement with him. If one day I happen to write a novel with desert appearing on the first page, I will inform him in advance, and he will start reading my novel from the second page. When I'm watching a movie, I don't like the phone ringing for a long time, and the person there looking at the phone and lingering to answer it. I wish that scene would pass as soon as possible. Can we know the reason for such feelings? In novels, I find dream scenes depressing. Since I'm a storyteller, and if the character in my novel has to have a dream, I cannot resist it. For example, there was a dream scene in my first novel, North, and it had to be written in the opening chapter. But I literally feel stressed and uneasy while writing these kinds of pages. I always assumed this mood was related to an ordinary matter of taste. But recently, I started to think it might have something to do with me losing my ability to dream. As a result of the severe brain trauma I suffered when I was a young man and the subsequent onset of chronic insomnia, I was unable to dream anymore. But I didn't mind because I was dealing with more serious health issues. At the time, I felt stuck enough to believe that it was also a legitimate human right to choose suicide to escape pain and impasse. More than 20 years have passed, and currently I can live in harmony with my insomnia. But although now I'm able to dream occasionally, the ability to dream has still not fully returned. However, at the beginning of the COVID-19 epidemic, when I entered another sleep therapy, I began to think that the reason why I didn't like dreams in novels was perhaps due to my own dream loss. And maybe that was also why I found myself writing novels. It was perhaps my aim to replace dreams that I turned to storytelling and started writing fiction just when my health was poor. Perhaps I was trying to obtain the other reality of dreams in the novel. While settling in the corona epidemic and a new sleep therapy process, I also started reading a book that opened up new paths in the way I looked at myself. The Red Book by Carl Gustav Jung. Although its existence had always been known, this work of Jung only came to light a few years ago. The Red Book, written in a calligraphic writing, can be seen as Jung's attempt to create psychology through the language of literature in the early 20th century. It was also an attempt to call for the return of God, whose death had been proclaimed in the modern ages. Jung titled these manuscripts Liber Novus, New Book in Latin, but it was known as the Red Book because it was written in red-bound notebooks. Jung, who worked intensively during the day, withdrew to his room at night and was making observations and conducting experiments on himself. That's why this book is also called Nocturnal Book. Concentrating on his vision and dreams, Jung examined his own mood with literary interpretations and called this mythopoetic imagination. So I decided to focus on visions with the inspiration of Jung, and recently started working on my new novel based on dreams. When I complete this novel, I hope I'm going to succeed. Maybe my ability to dream won't come back, but at least maybe my distaste for dreams in novels will disappear, and after focusing on vision and dreams in stories, I will begin to like reading dreams in books. Maybe then I can get a little more happy with myself. Like Orlando, who says, "Praise God that I am a woman," Pinocchio is filled with the same happiness at the end of the story and says, "How glad I am that I have become a well-behaved little boy." This is the joy of realizing the potentiality in actuality, as described by Aristotle. But at the beginning of the story, Pinocchio is nothing more than a piece of wood. Quote, "There was once upon a time a piece of wood in the shop of an old carpenter named Master Antonio. Everybody, however, called him Master Cherry on account of the end of his nose, which was always as red and polished as a ripe cherry. No sooner had Master Cherry set eyes on the piece of wood than his face beamed with delight, and rubbing his hands together with satisfaction, he said softly to himself, 'This wood has come at the right moment. It will just do to make the leg of a little table.' He immediately took a sharp axe with which to remove the bark and the rough surface, but just as he was going to give the first stroke, he heard a very small voice say imploringly, 'Do not strike me so hard.' He turned his terrified eyes all around the room to try and discover where the little voice could possibly have come from, but he saw nobody. Who, then, could it be? 'I see how it is,' he said, laughing and scratching his wig. 'Evidently, that little voice was all my imagination.' This is the possibility in existence, which Aristotle characterizes in his Metaphysics as potentially a statue of Hermes is in the block of wood. For this, imagination is needed. Master Cherry's neighbor, Geppetto, comes and tells him about his idea and asks for a block of wood. He says, quote, "This morning an idea came into my head. I thought I would make a beautiful wooden puppet, one that could dance, fence, and leap like an acrobat. I want a little wood to make my puppet. Will you give me some?" End quote. If you have the imagination to create a dancing puppet from a piece of wood, you produce it by feeding on the knowledge of doing so. That production is both the discovery of what exists in itself and the creation of what doesn't exist. It's Geppetto who creates a puppet from a piece of wood, but it's Pinocchio himself who creates a human being from a puppet. After all that, Pinocchio learns to be a good boy, helps people, and reaches the enchantment of being between dream and reality. Quote, "In the midst of all these wonders succeeding each other, Pinocchio felt quite bewildered, and he couldn't tell if he was really awake or he was dreaming with his eyes open." Pinocchio is not at the end, but at a new beginning. After the realization of becoming a human being, he will pass into the realm of the question, why? And this time he will embark on the adventure of searching for meaning in the face of death. The fulfillment of one potentiality doesn't mean the end of other potentialities. The question of a new truth appears in the space beyond the truth. Finding the great meaning that will end the loneliness of human beings lies in the possibility of a block of wood. The first fact of this possibility is that human being exists with imagination and comprehends the universe with meanings. Pinocchio's story begins as follows. Quote, "There was once upon a time a king," my little readers will instantly exclaim. "No, children, you are wrong. There was once upon a time a piece of wood." End quote. The adventure of human being also began not with a king, the primary mover of the universe, but with the matter of existence itself. And the human being brought forth thinking, dreaming, and creating hermes out of their own body. Beyond the scriptures that say that God created human being in their own image, human being has revealed their potentiality in God's image. Human being is not a mirror of God, but the reverse is true. However, Pinocchio is the mirror of human beings who try to create themselves, transcend their actual situation, and reach their potential by retelling their own story in the block of wood that is in the body of Pinocchio. While attempting to understand the relationship between the question of existence and human life, we are trying to explore the special future of art in creating the human soul and entire civilization. While examining the connection of art with concepts such as truth, beauty, and play, we call for the help of new definitions like Homo Artifex to state the importance of art in the birth of human being, similar to Homo faber or Homo economicus. As we ponder the decisive nature of life and death by connecting the evolution of humanity to the existence of art, we are trying to understand what we are and what we can be, especially by examining this process since the onset of religion and following the process through philosophy. When questioning the true meaning of existence, human beings are very much like standing in front of that empty wall in the Louvre Museum, in which emptiness we know that potentially there is a Mona Lisa. Like a statue of Hermes or Pinocchio in the block of wood, we can imagine as well as sense it. When we look at that empty wall, we hear our own voice echoing in our mind. Like Orlando said, "Praise God that I am a woman in the 20th century." Like Pinocchio said, "How glad I am that I have become a well-behaved little boy in the 19th century." We heard the human being, right from the beginning of their journey, say, "Praise God that I am a Homo Artifex." That was the beginning, and that is the end of my words. Thank you very much.